Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel discussion on Chinese-Western relations in the age of coronavirus. My name is Sam Rubenstein. I'm the head of press at the Cambridge Union, and I'm delighted to welcome you all. It goes without saying that this is a highly relevant and timely matter, and I'm thrilled to be joined by 5 esteemed and eminent experts on China and international relations more broadly. Before moving into a general and wide-ranging discussion, we'll hear from each of our panelists for some initial thoughts and reflections on what the future holds for China's place in the world. First off, we will hear from Dr. Kun-Chin Lin. Dr. Lin is the Deputy Director of the Centre for Geopolitics and is University Lecturer in Politics here in Cambridge. He is the Tun Sophian College Lecturer and Fellow of Gonville and Keyes College and Chair of the Editorial Board of the Cambridge Review of International Affairs. Dr. Lin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's been two decades since I sat in Professor Nye's lecture at Sanders Theatre. During this period, the American unipolar moment has come and gone. The market forces had failed to deliver us cross-border integration and political institutional convergence. And we also see that liberal ideology of human rights, multilateralism, have gone on the defensive. So for the realists, America has gone from a benevolent hegemon to an aggressive party over the redistributive issues of globalization. For liberals, they lament that multilateral institutional developments simply had not kept up with the forces of globalization. They would insist that COVID-19 pandemics, as well as climate change crisis, uphold the irrefutable logic of international cooperation. And China, being part of the problem, should also be treated as an equal in finding solutions. Now, both sides could agree that COVID-19 pandemic has generated impetus for change that might not allow us to restore normalcy or return to diplomacy as usual. So let me first offer you a few notes on the key emerging trends that will become salient over the next 5 years, and then try to draw some implications for the emerging world order. So the first observation is that instead of the block-on-block rivalry, as implied in the Cold War 2.0 argument, we're going to be seeing the material basis of power experiencing diversion and decentralization, with the rise of new forms of network power. In other words, new nodes of material exchange, legitimation, and power relations embedded in this turbocharged digitalization of economic transactions, the activation of new transport, logistics, and financial architecture, and restructuring of global value chains will be the dominant trends shaping power. The material basis of superpower will not be as concentrated as it was under the Cold War. And this process will deviate from the globalization as we have experienced it in the past few decades, because it will be concurrent with the political projects of doubling down on national sovereignty and sharpening of instruments of policy autonomy led by United States and PRC, but without either country offering public goods that could forge alliances and incentivize cooperation, as it was the case under the Cold War. The second observation is that theorists of power transition will have their hands full in trying to explain whether the US is rebounding or China is surpassing the US. Now, realists traditionally focus on military balance sheets and throw in some aggregate statistics about economics and influences in global institutions. China's rise has sort of led to a reconsideration that maybe China is working the system from a different angle, starting with trade, investment, and expanding influence through geo-economic projects like infrastructure. But it's not likely that these external projections of power will be able to continue or sustainable. Both countries have been significantly weakened by the pandemic. They will be working with far less resources and with renewed prioritization on dealing with domestic instabilities and chronic weaknesses. BRI will certainly be scaled back. As you might have heard, that many countries, recipient countries, are reneging on Chinese loans and contemplating rescheduling projects. And of course, Trump has withheld funding of WHO. The third observation is that it follows from the above that the linkage between domestic international politics will change. So the active realm of national security has been broadened prior to the pandemic with the cybersecurity and technology competition. But now we're adding public health as another dimension. Every thorny problem now has unprecedented connections of the internal and external dimensions of security. The political problems of balancing social protests on the streets against infections, restructuring supply chains justified by security of medical needs, mass unemployment to come as businesses push for digitalization, privacy concerns under fintech advancement, you name it. So as do politicians are swapping three-piece suits for PPEs in this current contemporary discourse, both in the United States and China. So there's a fatigue factor, of course, in making these connections, as most people don't really care about foreign policy, to be frank. But let's not forget that the trauma that we're experiencing and its long-term political effects. How would Italian politicians justify to her constituency that the Belt and Road Initiative is a win-win deal for them? So let's take some of these trends and then think about the implications for US-China rivalry. So we know that economic nationalism is on the agenda for both the United States and China. For US, it reflects the long-term trend of a declining hegemon. But let's ask ourselves, which country is more likely to engineer a fundamental shift in its mode of capital accumulation and material power? The China model or the US capitalism? Well, the China model is looking less and less like the East Asian developmental states as it delinks from the impetus of marketization and liberalization, even before it reaches the comfortable middle income class level of Korea and Taiwan before 1980s. American capitalism has a lot of problems, but I'll bet my pension on the latter, being able to innovate toward a new equilibrium of interdependence with other economies. Bringing everything back to American soil is just not realistic. So the key is to find non-China locations for cutting-edge industries such as biotech to place large-scale bets on outsourcing of R&D and production. And this is where American soft power in Europe, Asia, South Asia, especially Latin America and elsewhere, could be a significant advantage. China is investing in high technology sectors in Russia, but where else can it be assured of long-term cooperation? I think the interesting dynamics of this decentralized, decoupled landscape of superpower competition lies in the action of secondary powers. These powers have been playing a hedging approach between US and PRC since the late 1990s, which was possible and individually beneficial under two conditions. The first condition was that the basic rule of the game emphasized absolute gains from cooperation and compliance with US-based security and trade regimes. So there was an expanding pie, and the assumption is that the welfare enhancing dynamics of the market and American commitment to regional stability and elimination of global threats was good for everyone. The second condition was that security and economics could be delinked. So under the sort of general relative stable structure of interactions, secondary powers pursue relatively autonomous policies of development and control borders. So countries could flock to sign bilateral normalization agreements with China even before the US formally derecognized Taiwan. EU could hold different human rights stance to a PRC, and UK could be the first country to join the AIIB, or Italy the first to join BRI, despite US misgivings. And this is the same reason why the sprawling cross-border supply chains that have defined globalizations have not clearly followed any American interest in national security, energy, food, and public health security. So what will happen now? What will happen now or next is that it's not that secondary power will have to meekly accept any rigid security-oriented hierarchy of issues set by Americans or the Chinese. But from this point on, they will have to be aware and calculate the fine cost of going against the superpowers' preferences. And there will be very little room to fudge nominal compliance on both sides to play this game. The superpowers will have less to give and more to demand in return. Both China and US will print money, hard copy or digital. As you might have heard, China is rolling out the digital currency this year. So in 5 years, China could essentially become a challenger to the US in global currency. But at the same time, America will continue to export inflation and risk of its fiscal policy and military adventurism, while China will continue to export lax governance practices and capital that don't reflect the social environmental costs and real value of creation at home. Pick your poison. But secondary powers will have to choose to harmonize interests with one or the other, and that will affect the strength and weaknesses of the superpowers. Let me conclude with one example, which is the City of London, where we are. So as we know, Hong Kong is under tremendous stress. So we can expect there will be tremendous capital flight, Chinese and Hong Kong, from Hong Kong. And the Americans will continue to impose capital restrictions on PRC money. And London remains the largest RMB hub. What do we do here in London? What will Boris Johnson do? Well, financiers in London must be licking their chops. We remember back in 1950s and 60s, London took Russian golds and laundered rubles into US dollar for Russian transactions. In 1960 to the 80s, London was a prime site for petrodollar recycling. All these things will continue. London will play its advantage, but it's not going to be the same as before, because now London will have to be very careful to put in the kind of regulations on the haven-seeking US avoiding Chinese capital outflows so that it doesn't become subject to the kind of punishment that Trump and his successors will certainly impose on them. So these are the kind of issues I think secondary powers have to consider. And it's in these details, I believe, that's going to structure the nature of competition between the US and China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lin, for those fascinating insights. Our second speaker is Dr. Yu Ji. Dr. Yu is a senior research fellow on China at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, focusing on the decision-making process of China's political economy, as well as China's economic diplomacy. She speaks and writes frequently in outlets such as the BBC and the Financial Times, and regularly briefs senior political practitioners, including G7 member governments, the Silk Road Fund in Beijing, and major FTSE 100 companies. She has testified at the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee and the International Trade Committee, and has been recognized as a leading woman of the LSE for her contribution to teaching and engaging in public debates on China's foreign affairs. Dr. Yu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sam. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and honorary members of Cambridge Union. And just have to a little bit personal background. I mean, 18 years ago, for the first time when I came to the UK, and I was fascinated by the Thursday evening 7:30 o'clock debate. And now myself, after 18 years, has been in that position, but perhaps in a very different format in here tonight. But I'm delighted to share some of my thoughts regarding the so-called Sino-Western relations with many of you in here. Now, it seems to be that within the West, especially given the beginning of the pandemic and given the beginning of the outbreak, we seem to be holding that conventional wisdom that China one day will prefer to fulfill that vacuum left by the United States, but left to become somehow a global leadership. But however, I found this notion was deeply troublesome. Partially it's because China is facing its own domestic challenge. So I was just actually reading the notes was given by Premier Li Keqiang in the past 2 weeks of National People's Congress. And what I actually found out is China has continued to charter its own way of somehow become a self-reliant nation, but also focusing on its own economic priorities. And the reason why I'm saying this is not because I'm trying to apologize or whatsoever. What I'm trying to say is, imagine this is the country which have to create extra 9 million extra graduate jobs for the next year or so. And this is also a country, bear in mind, with a population of people who are still living under 200 pounds per month. And the proportion of the population is around 600 million people. And just imagine that tremendous economic challenge that China is facing nowadays. So to claim itself as being a global leader, and for me, that seems to be rather ironical. And perhaps China neither has the willingness and nor have the ability of doing so. Now, what really surprised me is for the first time in the last 35 years, and China has not announced a GDP growth target for the first time. Reason why? Because a double-digit growth for GDP is no longer be seen as a panacea to telling that positive story to the Chinese population. And instead, and what Xi Jinping has focused on this year, and also for the next 5 years or so for the Chinese Communist Party, it is to eradicate absolute poverty within the country. And absolute poverty means the people who are still living under the UN universal income bottom line, $1.9 per day. So having said of that, and why Xi Jinping is giving so much emphasis on poverty eradication this year, rather than focusing anything on so-called global leadership or pandemic diplomacy. And I think precisely is because China is a country that achieved tremendous economic success. But on the other hand, it is also a country with enormous income inequality. And I often joke this with my foreign friends that modern China nowadays is shaped by two Germans in two far ends of the political spectrum. On the one hand, modern China is shaped by the communism, so the founder of the communism, Karl Marx. But on the other hand, modern China is also shaped by Karl Lagerfeld, you know, the extravagant Chanel designer who really tailored the taste of the Chinese middle class as well. So the two cars that shape a modern and the paradox of China. So that's become rather oxymoron to me. And what exactly the Chinese Communist Party will have to do to closing that gap between richer and poor, to make China from one of the equal society in the past to somehow to one day become rather unequal society, and how are we going to closing that gap? And that's the major challenge for Xi Jinping rather than on the foreign affairs. So having said all that, it doesn't mean that China just want to retreat and does no longer want to take a leadership role. Whatever, China indeed would like to take a global leadership role, but very selectively. I mean, I'm sure, I remember back to 10 years ago, 11 years ago while I studied, and there was a debate on whether China should be considered as a revisionist power or China should be considered as a status quo power. So my answer in here is, I think we should choose very carefully, try not to simplify what, on the two spectrums, either is a revisionist or being status quo. I think China is indeed a revisionist power, but China chose very carefully on which area China would like to revise for the international system, and also on which areas China do not want to revise the international system. So give the example of financial governance and international economic governance or whatsoever. This is the areas, the aspects of international order that China prefer to retain within that international order. But however, issues on cybersecurity, issue on maritime security, where the other co-panelists would know much better than I do, and they will actually say China's indeed challenged the existing status quo of international order. So I think really the challenge for the West become much harder, try to navigate those different elements and how those different elements intertwined between one way to another to dealing with a much assertive but also stronger China with a bigger confidence with its own political system. So that's just on the domestic side of the story. On the foreign affairs, I think the challenge for China to go further in the future is we have seen a lot of positive initiative being put forward by the Chinese government. And perhaps the willingness, it is positive, but when it comes to execution, when it comes to implementation, perhaps it's really did not really achieve the desired output, the desired results. So at the end of the day, irrespective whatever the initiative put forward by China, it is, of course, it depends on the financial willingnesses and depends on political willingnesses of Chinese. But on the other hand, it is also depends on the perception that the rest of the world has towards China, and also how the rest of the world acting on that perception. So that's really how to change people's perception towards China, and especially in the West. And that's one of the key elements for current and also for the future Chinese leadership need to look into. Now, the central challenge for the Chinese leadership on foreign affairs, it is also how to peacefully coexist and how to work with the country on the transnational issues that somehow has ideological divisions towards China. And I only see that ideological division to go even further, if not closer. Now, just quickly to conclude, I mean, so far the scenario what we have is viruses do not really distinguish between democracy and autocracy. So one can agree that irrespective which political system we are, and it's the accountability that matters between the governor and the being governed. So to go further, that means really to be a great power, it is not just about get ideology right, but it's about generosity and offer concessions to the others, and not really judged by the ideology, but judged by the ability to unite the entire world. Now, so perhaps this is really the time for all of us to putting the ideology aside, and now saving life should really trump over everything else. So I end it in here and much look forward to your comments and disagreements.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Yu. We will now hear from Professor Joseph Nye. Professor Nye is a leading voice in the fields of political science and international relations, as one of the founders of the IR theory of neoliberalism. He was a key advisor to former Secretary of State John Kerry, serving on the US Foreign Affairs Policy Board, and has previously served as Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. His most recent book is called Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. The commentator and academic Daniel Dresner wrote that all roads to understanding American foreign policy run through Joe Nye. So it is an honor to welcome him virtually from America today to hopefully help us understand how America fits into this story. Professor Nye, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure for somebody who is often thought of himself as an Oxford graduate and thinks of the Oxford Union to be speaking at the Cambridge Union. I find myself in considerable agreement with Professors Lin and Yu. In the book that you just mentioned, Do Morals Matter? The last chapter says that there are two big shifts going on in power in the 21st century. One is the shift from west to east in the world economy, which is a traditional type of shift. And that brings up the question of great power politics and US-China or Western China relations. The other shift, which is less noticed, but Professor Lin mentioned it, is the shift from governments and the state to non-state actors and to trends that are transnational, which know no boundaries. And what's interesting is the interaction between these two, interesting for our subject tonight. With pandemic of COVID-19 is a clear example of a transnational trend. Viruses don't respect borders. Neither does climate change and a variety of other things, but let's stick with the pandemic for now. What I find is that the types of power that are relevant for a successful strategy are different. When you're talking about the great power rivalries, which are accentuated in Donald Trump's national security strategy of 2017, there are indeed problems such as jurisdiction over artificial islands in the South China Sea, which are essentially related to zero-sum competition or power over other countries. But when you're talking about pandemics or transnational issues or climate change, neither country can solve these problems acting alone. It's simply impossible. And the only way you can get progress on dealing with a strategy to deal with these transnational issues is when you have power with others rather than power over others. And that requires essentially a great deal of soft power to organize cooperation. So in the last chapter of my book, what I do is say the two great challenges for morality of foreign policy in the 21st century are going to be prudence in managing the great power rivalry, power over, and cooperation in dealing with the new transnational challenges, which are going to require power with. So how has the current crisis affected this? I wrote the book before the crisis, obviously. And some people say, well, maybe this will be a turning point in world politics. Unfortunately, I don't think so. I think what we're seeing is that the COVID-19 crisis has merely accelerated pre-existing trends rather than proved a turning point. And in that sense, the types of trends we're seeing was some decline in economic globalization, some increase in authoritarian politics, and some worsening of US-China relations. Those three trends, some of which coincides with what Professor Lin said, are accentuated rather than reversed by the current crisis. I think part of the reason for that is simply bad leadership. And here I actually put Donald Trump and Xi Jinping in the same category. Their first reaction to the crisis was denial, and delay, which made things worse, and then more denial, and then blame shifting. So rather than turning to cooperation, you basically got leadership which made things worse rather than better. And so China has been spending a great deal of time trying to change the narrative about its initial failures. And Trump has followed a very inept policy back and forth between different aspects and really trying to blame China, the WHO, for the problems that large part of which he has contributed to himself. So I think this is why we're seeing an accentuation of the trends that were pre-existing conditions, if you want. And then you have to ask yourself the counterfactual. Is it possible that we could have had a turning point, that things could have been different? Could it have been otherwise? And I argue that the answer to that is yes, that in a sense, when people talk about every country has to follow its national interest, what I argue in this book, Do Morals Matter, is it's not whether you follow your national interest, it's how you define the national interest. You can define it narrowly in a transactional sense, in which it's a zero-sum game, or you can define it broadly, which includes the interests of others. And Donald Trump, in the way he's defined America first, has defined it in that narrow transactional sense. But imagine that a different American leader, either in the last year or perhaps next year, were to take a different approach and to turn to the examples that I cite in my book from the period after 1945, in which American presidents like Harry Truman said, you know, we can essentially spend 2% of our GDP helping Europe to recover from the war, and it'll be good for the Europeans and also good for us. Suppose we had imagined that an American president and a Chinese president said, let's join together in the group of 20, leading other countries into a major Marshall Plan for an international COVID response capacity for poor countries, open to any poor country, regardless of ideology, to make them able to deal with this better. Think how different the world would look in terms of trends of decoupling, of US-China relations, of the whole nature of this competition if we were able or had a leader who had taken a position like that. Now you could say, well, this is utopian, or this is pie in the sky, but not necessarily. Think of it this way. If we look back to 1918, when you had the great influenza epidemic, it came in 3 waves. And interestingly enough, the second wave in the fall of 1918 killed more people than the first wave and carried on into 1919. Why should we expect that with COVID-19 there won't also be waves? If there is a reservoir of poor countries which are unable to cope with COVID-19, that reservoir will overflow back northward and reinfect us. And to think that we're going to be able to deal with transnational issues by walls or barriers or tariffs or decoupling is nonsense. So you could appeal to the public by saying, yes, we're going to take a lead on developing this major COVID response fund, but we're doing it for our own interest as well as for humanitarian interest. That would have the effect of protecting ourselves and incidentally increasing our soft power. So in that sense, I think it was a tremendous failure of leadership. In fact, I titled one of my columns for Project Syndicate, An Abysmal Failure of Leadership on both sides, both in China and in the US, but I particularly fault the US because I think that Donald Trump missed an enormous opportunity. And what we have to hope is that if there is a second or third wave, that there'll be a new American leader who might respond to that opportunity in a more creative and transformative way. So those would be my thoughts on how COVID is affecting China-Western relationship. So far badly, but perhaps we could hope for something better in the future.
Thank you very much, Professor Nai, for sharing your perspective. We will now turn to our penultimate speaker, Lyu Jinghua. A retired colonel of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, Dr. Lyu is an expert on cybersecurity and US-China defense relations. She's currently a visiting scholar with the Cyber Policy Initiative, overseen by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It is a privilege to have you here with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you for having me here. Please allow me to start my presentation from a joke that is frequently heard among Chinese and American scholars working on China-US relations. We always said that since there are so many obstacles for the two countries to overcome, the only chance for a real cooperation between the two countries is when the Earth is under attack from the alien. And now let's look at coronavirus. It is a creature from nowhere, which is unknown, which is spreading across the globe at an unprecedented scale and speed, and attacking the humankind as a whole, no matter what is the nationality, the color, the race, the class, the origin. And yet, all the features check the features of an alien, but what we have seen right now is the opposite. We are not seeing the two countries working together, but we are seeing the bilateral relationship in the status of so-called free fall. And more worse, the two countries are adding more pushes to make the two countries falling faster. So what's happened? Why during the pandemic, the two countries chose such a surprising way to deal with it? So to me, my observation is there are four very worrisome trends during the pandemic. And if we want to work together in the future, we have to think them through. The first trend, which is very worrisome to me, is that the two countries have been strategically suspicious of each other. And during the pandemic, all the suspicions are being reinforced. And more unfortunately, it is in a more ideological way. In the past, the US always suspects that China is taking advantage of the international order rather than contributing to it. And China always suspects that the US is suppressing or containing China's rights. But with the pandemic, the accusation is becoming more ideological. The US is accusing China to challenge the international order with a different model. And China now believes that a politically different China is not accepted by the liberal world. So such a reinforced suspicion are actually making both sides more aggressive, more sensitive, and more likely to over-interpret to each other's actions. The second trend I feel very worrisome is nowadays we have seen a lot of foreign policies are actually being driven by domestic political considerations. In the US, we saw that the change of attitudes towards China's fighting against coronavirus is very evident. In March, when the US was not affected, Trump has praised China's achievements. But in May, in June, when there were a lot of criticism about the failure of the government to handle the coronavirus, China is being criticized much more than before. So of course, for Chinese people, they view themselves as a scapegoat of the domestic failure of the Trump administration. And also another example comes from China, which is the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. There are many reasons, but one of them, the most significant one, is actually this is the diplomats trying to meet the cost from domestic audience to be more tougher in the international stage, because most people feel unfair to be criticized for the sacrifice, for the achievements on the international stage. So they really called for the diplomats to be more aggressive on the international stage, and we think the diplomats are taking actions on this direction. So the third trend is about what is the basis for policy making. It's a process cost-benefit calculation, but nowadays, to me, the analysis is changing. For the past 40 years, we know that the mutually beneficial economic exchanges have been the bedrock of China-US relations. So as long as it's mutually beneficial, both sides are willing to be part of it. But nowadays, what I'm seeing about trade war, about visa issues, about the deport of journalism are quite different. That is, it seems that it doesn't matter now if one side loses, but as long as the other side can lose more than yourself. And also, a policy doesn't appeal if one side wins, as long as the other side wins more. So the new way of cost-benefit analysis makes the governments to make irrational policy makings, and this will, we always assume that administrations are rational, but what if they are not rational anymore? The fourth trend is the change of public opinions. We always said after so many people-to-people exchange, we can know each other more, we can understand each other more, and maybe we can like each other more. But with the pandemic, we have seen several polls like Pew, like Harris, like YouGov, all made the same conclusion that 2/3 Americans are now holding a negative attitude towards China or Chinese people or Chinese government, whatever. And there is no similar polls in China, but if we do one, I guess the ratio will be much higher. That there'll be much higher percentage of Chinese now feel they don't like American anymore. And the change of the public opinions are driving the two countries into a negative spiral. So what we can do, I will just do a very quick to-dos and not to-dos. To-dos, first, maintain dialogues and then make negotiation mechanisms, and to maintain people-to-people exchanges, and to make sure that the mutually beneficial businesses can be maintained. And not to-dos, first, disinformation, not to interfere with the public opinion and manipulate public opinion, and not to fix concerns together, like not to securitize the economic issues, not to politicalize the foreign policies and the scientific research, not to make major power competition the theme of the international affairs. So I will stop here and look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We will now turn to our final speaker. The title of this event refers to the age of coronavirus, so it's important, I think, for us to explore the interplay between international relations and the ongoing pandemic. Dr. Yanzhong Huang is in prime position to do so, as a senior fellow for global health at the Council of Foreign Relations. He is the founding editor of Global Health Governance, the scholarly journal for the new health security paradigm, and professor at Seton University School of Diplomacy and International Relations. Professor Huang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sam. So I'm really honored to speak at this event. I'm going to focus on how the pandemic affected U.S.-China relations. We know that historically pandemics could affect international relations in many ways. They could lead to mass die-off, by undermining a country's fiscal base. We saw that during the plague of Justinian in the 6th century. That was the first recorded pandemic, but it reduced the population of Byzantine Empire by 40 to 50%, therefore shadowed that Justinian's effort to reestablish the Roman Empire. Pandemics could also undermine a nation's military power. In the 14th century, right, the bubonic plague intensified the Mongolian military's exposure to the plague, and that was a real factor in the decay of the Mongols' power, signalized by their retreat from China in 1368. They could also disrupt the war efforts and slow down perceptibly the military movement. The Spanish influenza in 1918 debilitated the war effort of the Central Powers more than that of the Allies, greatly impeded the German offensive of the spring of 1918, that if successful would have resulted in a victory for the Central Powers. They could also generate the urgency for international cooperation. We saw that during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, the US provided China with virus samples and diagnostic kits, therefore helping China becoming the first country to mass produce an H1N1 vaccine. And then Chinese scientists in turn will share their method with the world, facilitating the vaccine development efforts by pharmaceutical companies and American health agencies. To that, we saw exactly what Professor Nye mentioned, this power with others in dealing with a common challenge. But what we saw now in the current the outbreak is the use of power over others. So the pandemic only, in terms of US-China relations, only sets the two countries further apart. It's safe to say, well, this is the lowest point in US-China relations since 1989. So how has the pandemic affected US-China relations? I could identify 5, if not 6 factors or developments. The first, that the pandemic led to the rise of conspiracy theory on both sides. Right? We know that rumors thrive on fear and uncertainty. The outbreak of the novel coronavirus, that even today still leaves many unknowns, offers plenty of both. So we saw that within weeks of the pathogen's appearance, social media lit up with all the suggestions that the virus was a biological weapon. That conspiracy theory, disinformation campaign from both sides further undermined trust between the two nations. That might explain why China refused to allow US experts to visit Wuhan and why US scuttles its partnership with Beijing on public health. And secondly, the pandemic is intertwined with US presidential election politics to make Beijing an easy scapegoat, right? US ineffectiveness in handling the outbreak, the lack of progress in economic reopening, and the domestic racial tensions undermine President Trump's prospect of getting reelected. Right? So he needs to find easy scapegoats, and that is WHO/China. Right? Washington accuses Beijing for deliberately letting the virus infect the United States, and accuse the WHO for being a puppet of China. And third, the pandemic also accelerates the mood shift among policy elites who increasingly favor decoupling. In the United States, China being perceived as the origin of the pandemic, and the US being vulnerable to the disruption of the global supply chain in terms of active pharmaceutical ingredients, in terms of PPEs, only justify politicians and pundits to use the virus to demand a so-called hard decoupling, right, from China. And on the China side, even those liberal-minded elites and intellectuals now feel China increasingly bullied by the United States And they are also disappointed by the US failure in effectively addressing the outbreak and its domestic problems during the outbreak. So that led them to reassess the risks associated with Sino-American relations, and then some call for reducing Chinese dependence on US. And that is increasingly becoming the dominant mood among the elites and intellectuals in China. And fourth, the pandemic also nurtured more negative public opinion on the other side, in which Dr. Lyu has explained very well, so I'm not going to further explain. And the fifth, I think the pandemic also has lowered the bar for global leadership, right? Because of the WHO failure to exercise leadership in coordinating the international response to the outbreak, and because of the US refusal to play the leadership role in helping other countries fighting the pandemic. So that leaves plenty of opportunity for China to fill in the gap, right? So China has become more assertive in claiming the global leadership, right? And the US then feel even more threatened, right? We saw that this is how this new China strategy released on May 20th, right? Focused on adopting a competitive approach to the PRC that is based on so-called clear-eyed assessment of the CCP's intentions and actions, appraisal of the United States' many strategic advantages and shortfalls, and more importantly, a tolerance of greater bilateral friction. And finally, the pandemic may potentially affect the balance of power. It is true that the pandemic by definition, affects all the countries, but in terms of US-China relations, right, the impact may not be the same for both. So if that gap is significant enough, they may also potentially affect the power balance between the two countries. We don't know, this is whether that power balance shift is going to which side's favor, but one thing is for sure, the pandemic is significantly changing Chinese relationship with the rest of the world, especially the United States. And whether that change is reversible or not remains to be seen. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that. Now, we've actually had a lot of questions on the YouTube feed from people watching this. And there was one question that was directed towards Dr. Lin, but I wonder whether other people can comment on it if they so desire, which is there a strong enough relationship among middle powers to fill a potential power vacuum? Do you foresee middle powers working together in the vacuum that you envisage being left by China and the United States?
Power vacuum in what respect? Is it towards responses to pandemic narrowly, or is it a broader issue of supporting international institutions and norms? If the latter, I'm inclined to agree with Professor Nai that I'm fairly pessimistic about it right now, because I think countries, not just US and China, are turning inwards. And it will be very hard sell to provide international cooperation, given the kind of economic decline and social unrest that we're going to be seeing in a lot of countries.
Thank you very much. And one topic of a lot of the questions, I'm sure you can imagine, is the forthcoming presidential election in America. Now, Professor Nai, I think, so you touched on this quite a lot, as did you, Professor Huang. So I suppose to both of you, but also to everyone else, how important, how significant is the presidential election, and how different will Sino-American relations be if Biden is the president to what it will look like if Trump is the president?
Well, I think the presidential election matters quite a lot. Of the 14 presidents that I survey in my book, Trump is, I think, the most amoral and has done the most damage to American soft power. Many of my friends say that 4 years of Trump, they can hold their breath, my international friends. 8 years is a long time to hold your breath. And I think if Trump is reelected, it will have a significant negative effect on American foreign policy, but also on multilateral institutions. So I think it is a very important election. I think the pandemic has definitely worsened Trump's prospects. And now that, I mean, if we were asking in January, what were Trump's prospects of being reelected, a president with a positive economy, an incumbent president with a positive economy, most political science predictions are that leads to reelection. But now you have a pandemic which has been badly mishandled, a serious economic problem, unemployment in the range of 12–13%. And you have the third crisis of the protests over racial discrimination by police, which was triggered by the killing of George Floyd. And that none of those three have been handled well by Trump. So the public opinion polls now show him about 8 points behind Biden, though I should caution that in American politics, beware of any straight line predictions. Remember what I said, what we would have predicted in January is now very different in June, and November is still a good time away. But assuming that there is a change, and if Biden is the next president, there will be some improvement in US-China relations, but it won't be back to the Obama period or earlier, because there has been, as Dr. Huang said, there's been some changes in American domestic opinion, and I think you're going to, and Dr. Yu also said this, some of these changes were underway before these current set of crises. And in that sense, you're not going to get a certain return to what used to be thought of as normal, but you certainly will have a much less capricious and idiosyncratic presidency. And you will also have a number of people who are advising Biden who want to try to ask the question of how can you have cooperation and competition at the same time, which is the central question for the future of US-China relations. Yes, there will be competition. Question is to make sure there's also cooperation.
If anyone else wants to comment on what Professor Nye's just said, you just raise your hand so I know to unmute you.
Okay. Well, I fully agree with Professor Nye. I think President Trump really has squandered U.S. soft power in worldwide, and but particularly also in China. You have this, I have from my experience with dealing with Chinese intellectuals, former government officials, many of them were very, you could say pro-American, liberal-minded people, but they were just so disappointed, with what this administration has been doing. Now they increasingly even themselves in calling for like decoupling with the United States. And so, I agree with Professor Nye. Well, the election is indeed important. It may determine, the future, direction of the United States, but also the direction of the U.S.-China relations. I just want to point out that between now and the November election, right? Because this pandemic, then the economic downturn, and then those riots, caused by Floyd's death, that already hurt Trump's re-election prospect. So you're going to expect probably more moves or being or measures being undertaken by President Trump, that are going to make, because he wants to consolidate his, constituency, his support, to increase his chances of being reelected. So I expected this is going to be even taking even more radical, unpredictable moves that is going to hurt the bilateral relations, even more, that so you're going to expect the downturn, the spiral of U.S.-China relations is going to continue in the coming months.
If I may, I also want to share some observations from Beijing. People here are also following the election very closely. We know that different presidents will be different in their styles, but to China-US relations, most people are very pessimistic. We found out that one of the very rare consensus between the two parties is to be tough on China. The only question is which is tougher, or which is the wiser way to be tough on China. So the competition is not is inevitable, but what we hope here is the competition can be managed. That is not in a destructive way, but in a healthy way. And so election matters a lot, but people here are more determined, or more determined that the competition will be the major theme of bilateral relations.
Well, if I may, just adding 2 lines in here as well. As we said, the bedrock of US-China relations, it is on economic ties. But the trouble is the rest of the world now is facing a collapse of global demand. So for any economy, and that's going to be a challenge. So that would happen even more acute for China. I mean, for example, in the past 20 years or so, and China has really somehow created this sense of job and wealth. And then the rest of the world enjoy a wider choice of products and services at much lower price. But I'm afraid really all good things must come to the end, and China is no longer be seen as a benign force, and none that does not necessarily wage to pay out for the world through a massive stimulus. So what we have seen so far is China has to dealing with own domestic economic model challenges, and then while at the same time dealing with the ongoing tussle between the two countries. So, I mean, that's really one, the economy is not doing great. And secondly, one point which we have not mentioned in here is just in terms of mindset of young people. Now, in the past 20 years or so, the Chinese younger generation, for those who are older than me, it seems to take a far more positive views towards the United States. You know, that's the view of American is the bright future, and for many students who would like to study in the United States. But given the current generation of the Chinese, and especially those who were born after 1980s and those who were born after 1990s, and they have somehow enjoyed large prosperity within the home country, within China. And then on the other hand, and while they have studied abroad, and what they have witnessed is a resurgence of populism and a resurgence of things like a broken society in the West. So of course, they casting some kind of negative image towards the United States and towards Western democracy. So to some extent, that really the foundation, you know, people-to-people exchange is diminishing. So even if we are betting on the young people, perhaps would change the course towards more positive trend of US-China relations, it doesn't seem to be that's the case.
If I could add one point, I want to consider what Dr. Yu and Colonel Liu has brought up, which is the point of ideology. And this is, of course, related to the election. I'm wondering how likely it is how feasible to set aside ideology. So my feeling is that ideology is not the same thing. We're not talking about the same thing as, you know, in the 60s and 70s. Ideological divide now stems from several sources. One, as Colonel Liu pointed out, is the fact that, you know, in the West, we seem to agree that the Chinese political system has not changed with market reform. And this is not something that we expect to change anytime soon, contrary to liberal expectations. The second is that in past 15 years or so, there's been a strong strand of ideological assertiveness from within China. So until the very recent incidents of the Wolf Warriors, the PLA was the primary source of very assertive, you know, arguments about how China needs to be, you know, on the offensive. And you know, even as scholars like Seton at Tsinghua universities have talked about how China needs to stop pretending to be America's friend and start practicing more realism. So a lot of these are sort of long-going trends. And it's very hard for me to imagine the ideology of politicization could be avoided. I mean, for one thing, how would the propaganda department of the CCP respond to that?
Thank you very much for that. I think we should probably wrap up quite soon, but before we do, I'd quite like it if we could just go round and I'd like you to say, if you could give some advice to the American and Chinese governments about how they could potentially avoid the deterioration of their relationship. What advice would you give them? So let's start with Dr. Lin.
To improve the relationship, I think you have to work on the fundamentals. That means we're going to have to find new forms of internal balancing in realist terms, which means that you have to find new bases for creating material wealth and more equal distribution of wealth for people in our respective countries. I think that's the first thing to do. And once that base is available, then you can begin to talk about cooperation. So focus on domestic politics.
Dr. Yu?
Yeah, I was just going to say, perhaps the best way is firstly to accept differences. I mean, the two political systems are simply incompatible. It doesn't mean which system is better and which system is worse. We're not in that zero-sum game here for the competition. So that's things number one. And things number two is working on young people. Try to change the negative perception that young people of both countries have towards each other.
Thank you very much. Professor Nye?
I would say keep your eye on the long run in the sense that these larger transnational issues are going to do huge damage both to China and to the US. This is not our last pandemic, and climate change is there behind us. And we are not going to be able to solve that alone. US and China together put about 40% of the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. There's no way that you can imagine China solving that or US solving it by themselves. They're going to have cooperation also with others. So that would be my major advice. In the short term, I would say that I agree very much with the nice list that Colonel Lyu suggested of do's and don'ts. If we could get our leaders to implement her list, we'd have a better chance of looking at these long-run joint gains.
Jinghua Liu?
Okay. Aside from the list, I think there is one thing very important that we have to remind ourselves that the world is not only about China and the United States. There are many more countries also contributing to the international order, to the world peace. So one thing that the two countries should do together is not to force other countries to take side, not to force the other countries to be an ally or to be part of the competition between the two countries.
Thank you very much. And finally, to conclude, Professor Huang.
So sort of my advice is very close to Professor Nye's. Basically, you don't have to be friends to work with each other, right? Even during the Cold War era, right, the Soviet Union and the United States, they cooperate in dealing with, polio and smallpox outbreaks, right? So I think even though the two countries are engaged in a new Cold War, that doesn't necessarily mean they cannot identify areas, they can cooperate and collaborate with each other by issues like what Professor Nye mentioned, but the climate change, global health, even cyber security, right? As far as global health is concerned, but this is like the area of biotechnology, right? You could actually develop protocols in terms of preventing the biotechnology from being abused, or used for pernicious purpose. So even in those areas, we thought it was like, we shouldn't allow China to steal our, secrets or anything. You still need to cooperate with each other.
Thank you very much for all of your concluding remarks. This has been a very fascinating discussion, obviously very timely and pertinent. So thank you to everyone for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Sam.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.